The air at the edge of Highway 95 was a thick, shimmering blanket of heat and indifference. It smelled of scorched asphalt, stale coffee, and the faint, metallic tang of gasoline. Arthur stood by the pumps of the dusty, forgotten filling station, a ghost in a grease-stained uniform. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if each one cost him something precious. He was a man folded into himself, his shoulders perpetually stooped under a weight no one else could see. Customers came and went, their faces blurred by haste and anonymity. They saw a quiet, middle-aged man with haunted eyes and a name, Arthur, stitched in faded red thread over his pocket. They saw a fixture, a piece of the scenery, as unnoteworthy as the sun-bleached soda signs and the buzzing fluorescent lights inside. Then there was Lily, a small, bright spark in the gray expanse of his day. She would arrive in a dented sedan with her mother, Sarah, a woman whose smile was as worn and tired as the tires on her car. While her mother filled the tank with the last of her week's pay, Lily would stand by the station door, her wide, blue eyes fixed on Arthur. He never said much. He'd just give her a small, almost imperceptible nod, and a moment later, emerge with a cookie, saved from the morning's stale batch. He'd press it into her small hand, a silent conspiracy between the forgotten man and the frightened child. It was the only time his face seemed to lose its stony mask, a flicker of warmth in the cool gray of his eyes. Today, the ritual was shattered. Just as he offered the cookie, a mud-splattered pickup truck screeched to a halt inches from the pump, its engine a guttural roar of aggression. A man swung out of the driver's side, his face flushed with cheap beer and belligerence. This was Rick, Sarah's new husband. He was built like a refrigerator with a thick neck and small, mean eyes that took in the scene with instant disdain. "What's this?" he boomed, his voice scraping across the quiet afternoon. He snatched the cookie from Lily's fingers, crumbling it into dust. "We don't take charity from gas station trash." Lily's face crumpled, a silent sob catching in her throat. Rick turned his sneer on Arthur. "You got a problem, old man?" He jabbed a thick finger at Arthur's chest. "Or you just like handing out freebies? Maybe I should talk to your boss about what a great employee you are." The few other customers at the station, a family in a minivan, a trucker fueling his rig, averted their gazes. They fiddled with their wallets, checked their phones, suddenly fascinated by the cracks in the pavement. Their silence was a verdict, a wall that left Arthur standing alone. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stood there, his eyes fixed on the crushed cookie on the ground, his face a mask of granite. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot spike driven through his chest. He was just a nobody, a loser, exactly as the man had said. The world had already judged him. The encounters with Rick became a cruel, recurring theater of degradation. He seemed to take a perverse pleasure in stopping at the station, not for gas, but for the opportunity to chip away at Arthur's composure. Each visit was a new performance. One day he'd toss a crumpled bill on the ground, forcing Arthur to stoop and pick it up. "Hurry it up, Grandpa. Some of us have places to be." Another time, he'd loudly dispute the price of a soda, accusing Arthur of trying to skim a few cents, his voice carrying across the lot for all to hear. He'd call him Sarge with a mocking snarl, twisting a title of respect into an insult aimed at Arthur's worn, military-style boots. Arthur would just absorb it, his face impassive, his hands steady as he counted out the change. His boss, a wiry man named Henderson who valued peace over principle, would watch from his office window, wringing his hands but doing nothing. "Don't cause trouble, Arthur," he'd warned him once. "That guy's a hothead. Just let it go." But the true target, the real victim in Rick's cruel game, was Lily. He used her as a weapon to torment her mother and to assert his dominance in public. Arthur would watch, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest, as Rick yanked her by the arm, his fingers digging into her fragile skin. "Stop your whining," he'd hiss, his voice a venomous whisper that was louder than a shout. "You're embarrassing me." Sarah would try to intervene, her voice trembling. "Rick, please, you're hurting her." And Rick would turn on her, his eyes flashing with a dangerous fire. "You want some too?" "Get in the car." The community of transient customers remained a silent chorus of witnesses. They saw the bruises that sometimes shadowed Lily's arms, heard the fear in her mother's voice. Yet they did nothing. They paid for their gas, bought their snacks, and drove away, leaving the ugliness behind them in their rearview mirrors. It was not their problem, not their family, not their fight. For Arthur, every silent moment was an echo of a past he had tried to bury, a failure to act that felt like a fresh wound. He could feel the pressure building inside him, a dormant volcano of rage and duty, and he feared the day it would finally erupt. He was a man holding back an ocean with his bare hands, and the tide was rising. When the station was empty and the desert night fell, casting long shadows that looked like grasping fingers, Arthur's mind would drift back. The smell of diesel fumes would transport him not to the highway, but to the dust-choked air of Kandahar. He wasn't a hero in his memories. He was just a sergeant, responsible for a dozen young men who had trusted him with their lives. He remembered their faces, their laughter, the letters they wrote home. He remembered the weight of his rifle, but more, he remembered the weight of their futures in his hands. He remembered Preacher, a giant of a man who could quote scripture one minute and dismantle a machine gun the next. He remembered Skinny, a kid from Ohio who was always talking about the farm he was going to buy. He remembered the quiet pacts they made in the dark, promises to look after each other's families if the worst happened. He never spoke of the day it all went wrong, the sudden, blinding flash, the concussive roar that stole the air from his lungs. He remembered throwing himself over two of his men, his body absorbing the storm of shrapnel. He remembered the searing pain, the darkness that followed, and waking up in a field hospital with a silence in one ear that would never leave. They had called him a hero, pinned a medal to his hospital gown. But all he felt was the failure. Skinny never made it home to his farm. The medal felt like a brand, a reminder of his own survival at the cost of another's. After that, and after losing his wife to a quiet, merciless illness a few years later, the world of violence and valor held no appeal. He made a new promise, a silent one to her memory and to their son, Daniel. He would build a life of peace, no matter how small or insignificant it seemed. This menial job, this quiet existence, was his penance and his sanctuary. His restraint in the face of Rick's taunts was not cowardice. It was the iron discipline of a man who knew the true cost of violence and had sworn an oath to abandon it. He was holding on to that peace for his son, a fragile shield against the chaos he knew lurked just beyond the edges of their quiet life. The pressure reached its breaking point on a Tuesday evening, under the sickly yellow glare of the station's overhead lights. A storm was brewing on the horizon, the air thick and electric with unspoken tension. Rick's truck swerved into the lot, tires spitting gravel. He was drunker than usual, his movements clumsy and his words slurred into a thick snarl. He stumbled out of the truck, dragging Lily behind him. She was crying, a heartbreaking, hiccuping sound that cut through the low hum of the coolers inside the store. "I told you to shut up," Rick roared, his face a mask of pure rage. Sarah scrambled out of the passenger side, her face pale with terror. "Rick, stop. She's just a child." He turned on Sarah, his hand lashing out. He didn't hit her, but he shoved her hard against the side of the truck. Her head hit the metal with a sickening thud, and she slid to the ground, dazed. Rick ignored her, his attention fixed back on the weeping child. He raised his hand, open and ready to strike. The world seemed to stop. The only other person there, a salesman refueling his sedan, froze with the nozzle in his hand, his eyes wide with horror. Then, as if waking from a trance, he quickly hung up the nozzle, jumped into his car, and sped away without even closing his gas cap. Inside, Henderson, Arthur's boss, saw the whole thing unfold through the plate glass window. He took one step towards the door, then stopped, and retreated back into the shadows of his office. The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum of human courage. Arthur, on his break, was standing in the doorway of the small employee locker room. He saw the raised hand. He saw Lily's terrified face, squeezed shut in anticipation of the blow. In that instant, the promise he made to his wife and the oath he had taken to his men converged into a single, undeniable command. The peace he had so carefully constructed was a fortress built on sand, and the storm had finally arrived to wash it all away. His fists, hanging by his sides, slowly clenched, the knuckles white. Arthur moved. There was no hesitation, no outward sign of the war raging within him. He simply stepped out of the shadows and into the yellow light, his worn boots making no sound on the oil-stained concrete. He didn't run. He walked with a calm, deliberate pace that was more intimidating than any charge. He placed himself directly between Rick's raised hand and Lily's tear-streaked face. He was a wall suddenly erected. He didn't say a word at first. He just stood there, his presence a silent, immovable objection. Rick, startled by this sudden apparition, lowered his hand, his drunken brain struggling to process the interruption. "What the hell do you want?" he slurred, squinting at Arthur. "Get out of my way, you pathetic old man." Arthur's voice, when it came, was not loud. It was a low, steady rumble, like distant thunder. That's enough. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a lifetime of command, of battles fought and lines held. They hung in the air, a stark contrast to Rick's blustering rage. Enraged by the defiance, Rick shoved Arthur hard in the chest. "I said move." It was a powerful shove, meant to send the smaller man sprawling. But Arthur didn't budge. He absorbed the impact without so much as a single backward step, his feet rooted to the ground. He was no longer just a gas station attendant. He was Sergeant Arthur Jensen, holding the line. He looked directly into Rick's eyes, and for the first time, Rick saw something other than a quiet loser. He saw a depth of resolve he couldn't comprehend, a chilling stillness that promised consequences far beyond a simple fistfight. Arthur shielded Lily with his body, turning slightly to block her from Rick's view. "The girl and her mother are staying here," he stated, his voice devoid of emotion. "You can come back for them when you're sober. Or you can leave now and not come back at all." He was risking everything. His job, his physical safety, the quiet life he had sacrificed so much to build. He was drawing a line not in the sand, but in solid rock, and he was prepared to die defending it. Rick stared, his drunken fury momentarily short-circuited by a primal fear he couldn't name. The man before him was an enigma. He hadn't fought back, hadn't raised his voice, yet he had won. The power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. You'll regret this," Rick stammered, his bravado crumbling into a pathetic threat. "You're finished. I'll have your job. I'll ruin you." He pointed a trembling finger at Arthur, but the gesture lacked conviction. It was the last gasp of a defeated bully. He backed away, stumbled into his truck, and peeled out of the station, tires screaming in a final, impotent display of aggression. He left behind a cloud of exhaust and a stunned silence, leaving Sarah and Lily under the yellow lights. The spell was broken. Henderson, the owner, emerged from his office, his face a mixture of fear and something else, awe. He had been ready to fire Arthur on the spot for provoking a customer. Now he just stared, speechless. The young cashier, who had been hiding behind the counter, peeked over, his eyes wide. He looked at Arthur not as the quiet guy who cleaned the bathrooms, but as something monumental. From the side of the building, an elderly man who had been pretending to tie his shoe for the last 5 minutes, slowly straightened up. He caught Arthur's eye and gave a single, slow, deliberate nod, a gesture of profound respect. Sarah, still on the ground, pushed herself up, her dazed expression clearing. She rushed to Arthur, tears of gratitude streaming down her face. "Thank you," she sobbed, clutching his arm. "Oh God, thank you," the whispers began then, carried on the electric air. "Did you see his eyes?" the cashier said to Henderson. He didn't even blink. The narrative was changing. The quiet, dismissed man was being recast in the minds of the few who had witnessed his stand. They hadn't seen weakness in his stillness. They had seen an impossible strength. They hadn't seen a gas station attendant. They had seen a guardian. The shift was subtle but absolute, like the turning of a great tide. Just as a fragile sense of peace began to settle over the small group, a new sound intruded. It started as a low, distant rumble, a vibration felt more in the chest than heard with the ears. It grew steadily, multiplying, until it became a deafening, ground-shaking roar. Heads turned towards the dark highway. One pinpoint of light became two, then four, then a dozen, then an entire constellation of them descending upon the station like a rolling thunderstorm. A long, formidable line of motorcycles materialized from the darkness. They were not weekend hobbyists on polished cruisers. These were Hell's Angels. Their bikes were snarling beasts of chrome and steel, and the men who rode them were cut from the same cloth. They wore leather cuts adorned with the infamous Death's Head patch, their faces weathered and grim, their eyes hidden behind dark glasses. They flooded the station, their engines idling with a menacing growl that vibrated through the concrete. They formed a loose, intimidating circle, effectively cutting the station off from the rest of the world. Henderson ducked back inside. Sarah instinctively pulled Lily closer. The lead rider cut his engine, and the sudden partial silence was more jarring than the noise. He was a mountain of a man, with a thick gray beard braided into two sections and a presence that commanded absolute authority. This was Preacher. He swung his leg over his bike, his heavy boots hitting the pavement with a solid thud. He surveyed the scene, his gaze sweeping over the frightened faces, before it landed on Arthur. He started walking towards him, his steps slow and deliberate. It looked like a confrontation, the final act in a night of violence. But then Lily, who had been hiding behind her mother, did the unthinkable. She broke free and ran, not away from the terrifying biker, but directly towards him. She grabbed onto the leg of his leather pants, her small voice trembling but clear. "Please," she begged, looking up at the giant. "The bad man is coming back. Please, don't let him take me." The other bikers watched, their stone faces unreadable, but a current of something unidentifiable passed through their ranks. Preacher stopped dead in his tracks. For a long moment, he looked down at the small child clinging to his leg. Then, with a gentleness that seemed utterly incongruous with his fearsome appearance, he slowly knelt down, bringing his massive frame to her level. The leather of his pants creaked as he moved. He reached out a hand, not with the thick, calloused fingers, but with the back of his knuckles, and gently brushed a tear from her cheek. His voice, when he spoke, was a low, gravelly rumble, but it held a surprising kindness. "Don't you worry, little bird," he said, his eyes softening. "No one's taking you anywhere." He then looked up, his gaze locking with Arthur's over Lily's head. A slow, incredulous smile spread across his face, cracking the weathered mask. "Sergeant?" he said, his voice thick with disbelief and a dawning recognition. "Sergeant Jensen? By God, I thought that was you." The air crackled with the unsaid history between the two men. Arthur gave a small, weary nod. "Preacher," he acknowledged, his voice raspy. The other bikers, hearing the name, began to dismount, their hard expressions melting away into looks of shock and reverence. They crowded around, forming a protective circle, but their attention was now solely on Arthur. "It is him," one of them whispered, a man with a long scar down his cheek. "It's the ghost." Preacher stood up, his eyes never leaving Arthur's. "We heard you were gone, Sergeant. Read your name on a memorial wall online." Arthur just shook his head slightly. "It was a mistake. I just wanted some quiet." The truth began to unravel, not from Arthur, but from the men who had served under him. The scarred biker, whose name was Cutter, turned to the bewildered Henderson and Sarah. "You people have no idea who this man is, do you?" he said, his voice rough but filled with emotion. He pointed a leather-gloved finger at Arthur. "We called him the Ghost, because he was the quietest man in the platoon, but he was always there. He walked point through IED alleys like he was taking a stroll in the park." Then Preacher's voice cut through, telling the rest of the story. His tone was heavy, filled with a debt that could never be fully repaid. He described a dusty afternoon outside a village in Helmand Province. An ambush. A sudden explosion that sent a hailstorm of metal and fire into their position. "We were caught in the open," Preacher said, his voice dropping low. "Me and Cutter, we were done for. Nowhere to go. And then this man," he gestured to Arthur. "He threw himself on top of us, took the whole blast on his back, saved our lives, and nearly lost his own." He looked at Arthur's slightly stooped shoulders with new understanding. "That shrapnel they couldn't get out. It's still in there, isn't it, Sarge?" Arthur didn't answer, but the quiet pain in his eyes was confirmation enough. He had never spoken of it, never claimed any glory or disability. He had simply carried the weight, both physical and emotional, in silence. The forgotten gas station attendant was a hero, a legend they had mourned and revered for years. The revelation hung in the air, heavy and profound. The bikers looked at Arthur with an intensity of respect that bordered on worship. He was not just a man they knew. He was a part of their very survival, a living embodiment of the highest honor they understood. Sacrifice for your brothers. Preacher, his face a mask of raw emotion, did something that stunned everyone present. He began to unlace the sides of his own coat, his leather vest. This was not just a piece of clothing. It was his identity. It held his rank, his club's sacred patches, the years of his life written in leather and thread. To remove it for another was an act of ultimate deference, a gesture reserved for the highest echelons of honor. With solemn reverence, he slid the heavy vest off his own shoulders and walked to Arthur. He gently, carefully, draped it over Arthur's smaller frame. The vest was too big, but it settled on him like a king's robe. "You were our sergeant then, and you're our brother now," Preacher said, his voice thick. "This family is your family. Your fight is our fight." The community's recognition followed. Henderson, the station owner, stepped forward, his face flushed with shame and awe. "Arthur, I had no idea," he stammered. "Your job is safe." "Of course it is. I'll give you a raise. Promotion. You can be the manager." Arthur, looking uncomfortable with the attention, simply shook his head. "Thank you, Mr. Henderson, but this is fine." His quiet refusal was more powerful than any demand. He didn't want a reward. He had acted from principle, not for gain. The bikers, meanwhile, moved with quiet efficiency. Two of them escorted Sarah and Lily to a nearby motel, paying for a week in advance and leaving their numbers with the front desk. "You call if you need anything," one of them said to Sarah. "Anything at all." Another group, led by Cutter, mounted their bikes. "We're just going to have a talk with a man named Rick," Cutter said with a chillingly calm smile. "Make sure he understands he's no longer welcome in this town." They didn't speak of violence, but the promise of it hung in the air, a shield of absolute protection around Arthur and the family he had saved. The system had failed, the community had been silent, but now a different, more ancient code of loyalty had asserted itself. The sun rose the next morning on a transformed world. When Arthur arrived for his shift, the gas station was no longer a desolate outpost of loneliness. Several motorcycles were parked neatly by the side of the building, their chrome gleaming in the early light. Preacher was there, sipping coffee on an overturned crate, a silent, watchful sentinel. Another biker was methodically fixing a loose shutter on the station window, while a third swept the lot with a focus that suggested it was the most important job in the world. They had claimed this small patch of asphalt as their own territory, and Arthur as their own leader. The community, too, had changed. Cars that used to speed past now slowed down. People who had once looked through Arthur now met his eye, offering nods of respect and quiet smiles. A local farmer dropped off a box of fresh vegetables. The waitress from the diner down the road brought him a hot breakfast and a thermos of fresh coffee. "This is from all of us," she said, her eyes shining with admiration. "Thank you." Later that morning, Sarah's dented sedan pulled in. She looked rested for the first time in years. The lines of fear around her eyes softened. Lily jumped out and ran to Arthur, not with fear, but with a bright, beaming smile. She clutched a piece of paper in her hand. It was a drawing, rendered in the earnest, vibrant colors of a child's crayon set. It depicted a tall figure with Arthur's quiet eyes, wearing a huge leather vest. He was surrounded by a phalanx of roaring motorcycles, and above his head, Lily had drawn a shining gold star. She handed it to him, her small gesture of recognition meaning more than any medal. Arthur took the drawing, his fingers tracing the crayon superhero. He looked at Lily, then at his own son, Daniel, who was playing nearby, tossing a ball with one of the younger bikers. A profound sense of peace settled over him, different from the fragile quiet he had sought before. This was a solid peace, forged in action and fortified by loyalty. As the day drew to a close, the bikers prepared to leave. There were no long goodbyes. Preacher simply walked over to Arthur, clapped him once on the shoulder, and shared a look of complete understanding. He mounted his bike, and with a single hand signal, the engines roared to life in unison. The sound was no longer a threat. It was a chorus, a promise of brotherhood that would echo across the desert. They thundered onto the highway, a dark river of steel and loyalty, leaving Arthur standing in the quiet evening, a forgotten man no more, finally at home in his own skin.